Hi, listeners. Your host, Dr. Marie McNeely here. This is episode 616 of People Behind the Science, and we are excited to be rebroadcasting our interview with Dr. Vic Arcus, originally published on June 29th of 2015. Listeners, Vic's research has investigated the structural and functional biology of toxin-antitoxin networks and microbes, focusing particularly on the bacteria that causes tuberculosis. His lab also does work on the thermodynamics of biological systems, as well as on enzyme engineering, which may contribute to the development of new antibiotics. And in this interview, Vic shares more about his life and his science. So listeners, we hope you enjoy hearing from him in this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Listeners, I am thrilled to be here today with Dr. Vic Arcus. So, Vic, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks.
Wonderful to hear, and I'm excited to introduce you now to our listeners. So listeners, just a few details here. Vic is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees in organic chemistry from the University of Waikato and his PhD in molecular biology from Cambridge. Afterward, Vic became a fellow of Trinity College and then served on the faculty at Auckland University before returning to Waikato, where he is today. And listeners, Vic is here with us today to tell us about his journey through life and science. So today, Vic, we are looking forward to getting to know you, not only as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start off by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not doing science?
Well, my interests are exercise and music, I think, are the two main interests of mine. I do a lot of exercise. I'm an amateur triathlete.
Really? Wonderful.
And then I also learn the piano. So I feel like a small child. I go to my piano teacher once a week and she chastises me for not doing enough practice.
Right.
But I really enjoy playing the piano. And also I read a lot about music. So I'm reading a biography of Bach at the moment, which is very, very interesting.
Fantastic. So what is the most recent piece you have mastered in your piano lessons, Vic?
At the moment, I'm playing two pieces. One is a Schubert sonata, which is actually an unfinished sonata of his, which is very interesting. So it was written when he was 18 years old. And so he wrote the first half of it and then left the second half unfinished. And so the second half is the editor's version of the sonata. But it's pretty clear how it would have gone had he finished it. I put it down to the fact that he was a youthful exuberance.
Right. Got distracted.
He wrote the first half and then he knew how the rest of it was going to go. So he moved immediately on to the next thing that he was doing.
Well, very cool to hear about what you do in your free time. And I know I've tried to pick up the piano on multiple occasions. I'm a violinist myself, so I think the two different lines of music going at once I struggled with too much. But very cool to hear about how you're spending time when you're not busy at work. But next, we are going to talk about your work, Vic. Can you tell us about how you describe what you do to someone who's not familiar with your field?
So my wife, when she's being somewhat disparaging, describes what I do as proteins, blah, blah, proteins.
Right.
Which is quite a good summary, actually.
It's got the gist.
I'm a protein person. I'm really interested in the function of proteins inside cells. And I'm a biochemist, so we look at the function of enzymes outside the cell, and then we do quite a lot of molecular biology to try to match up the function of the enzyme outside the cell with the function inside the cell. And more recently, we have done a lot of work on the evolution of enzymes, and so that's become really exciting and interesting.
Well, very cool to hear a little bit about your work. And I understand you work in a variety of different systems, looking at antibodies to soil microbes all the way to flowering plants. This is a really interesting variety. How did you develop this research program with so much variety in it?
I guess it reflects my unedited curiosity, I would say. My expertise originally was in chemistry, and so I came to biology very late, really at the end of my PhD. And because I'm a naive biologist, I just find everything about biology fascinating. And because proteins and enzymes are obviously straddle the whole of biology, then it's quite easy to link that biochemistry up with lots of different types of biology.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful to hear how you're able to mix it up a little bit, and we'll chat a little bit more about your research as we go through the interview. But let's take a moment to talk about motivation. I think every researcher has so much to get done in a day, and I'm a quote person, so I love to grab little tidbits of inspiration and motivation from everyone that I talk to. So Vic, can you share with us today one of your own favorite motivational or inspirational quotes?
So I have a quote here. Perhaps it's not really fair because it's from Dr. Seuss.
Fantastic source of inspiration.
Yes, and I first discovered this when it was read at a wedding at a friend of mine 20 years ago or so. And we've sort of incorporated this into our lab mantra. He wrote a book called Oh, the Places You'll Go.
One of my favorites.
I think the saying goes, you have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes, you can steer yourself any direction you choose. And although that is slightly flippant, as Dr. Seuss is, I think it kind of reminds me that we're blessed. If you've got brains in your head and feet in your shoes, and you have shoes on your feet, then you're blessed.
Definitely. And you have really the ability to take yourself where you want to go. And I love that story. That was one of the gifts that I got for my graduation in college. And it was something I kind of look back to every now and then for inspiration.
We give a copy of this book to all the people who graduate with their PhD.
Oh, fantastic.
We have a tradition in the lab. When you get your PhD, we have champagne and you get a copy of that book.
Well, I love that tradition, and I really like this quote. And I'm curious to hear now, Vic, we've heard a little bit about a motivational saying that you guys use in the lab. Can you tell us about some of these people who you've encountered along your journey as a scientist who motivated or inspired you, some of these role models you've had?
Well, I would say that I always go back to my PhD supervisor. As a young New Zealander, I went to Cambridge on a scholarship, and I arrived in Cambridge, and to be really honest, I was absolutely terrified. I couldn't imagine what anyone in Cambridge would want to have anything to do with a small bumpkin from New Zealand. And I ended up working for one of the big professors at the chemistry department. He's now Professor Sir Alan Furst. And he took me on. I mean, he's one of the giants of back then enzyme kinetics, then protein folding, and then diseases of misfolding. And he taught me an enormous amount, and he had quite a reputation, but he was very paternal towards people in his group, if you know what I mean. So if you were in his group, he
took care of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he was also quite a formidable figure. And so there was this tension for me because I was at the beginning quite terrified of being in Cambridge anyway. But slowly I grew to know him and what his priorities were, and I've never forgotten them. One of his main priorities was collecting high quality data. So that data is the king, and you must collect high quality data and pay attention to how you collect the data. And if you have high quality data, then you can make high quality hypotheses about what the data is telling you.
Definitely.
And that stood the test of time for me. And I've always admired him.
Well, it sounds like this is a fantastic role model to have and a really good person to connect with going into a new country where you're feeling unsure about yourself. And a lot of scientists describe this feeling, whether it's going into grad school, postdoc, their first faculty position, feelings of self-doubt and this almost little fish in a big pond syndrome. So what helped you get over this?
It took a long time to get over it. It took a long time to get some confidence in that environment. But in a way, the environment, I didn't realize it at the time, but in the environment suited me because we were really left to our own devices. I was working in a very big group. He had a large group in Cambridge, and I had some excellent mentors who were postdocs in his group. So working for him was fantastic. But for the first 18 months, really, I was left to my own devices. But I was really fortunate to have two fantastic postdocs in the lab who really looked after me.
Well, wonderful to hear a little bit about your role models, some of these people who helped you along and shaped your career. I want to know, though, Vic, if we can rewind a little bit further, and can you tell us where your original interest in science began? One of these earliest memories that you have of liking science?
That's a very interesting question because I think I came to science quite late in the piece. When I look back, I think one of the really significant moments was the BBC series called Life on Earth, which was done by David Attenborough. I have a copy of the book, Life on Earth, which he wrote, which went along with that series, and it was published in 1979, so I would have been about 12. Mm-hmm. But going through school, I just assumed that I was going to be a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. So I never considered being a scientist when I was at school. But once I got to university, fortunately in New Zealand at that time, to get into any professional school, like an engineering school or a medical school, you had to do an intermediate year, which meant that you had to do a general year before you could get into any of these schools.
Okay.
And so my first year at university was a general year where I did chemistry, maths, and philosophy. And I loved that so much that I decided to stay on and not go to one of these professional schools and stick with chemistry and philosophy. So I did chemistry and philosophy for my undergraduate degree.
Very interesting. Well, I know David Attenborough, you mentioned, is, I think, so many people's one of their heroes in science. And I remember watching David Attenborough hosting a lot of different programs when I was growing up, too, and thinking, like, this man knows everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very inspirational figure. And great to hear about where your start in science was and how you progressed through those early stages. But can you tell us next how you went from that undergraduate, now getting into science, to the professor that you are today? What are some of these key moments?
I think the first key moment was when I decided not to go to the professional school and to stay on and do just a Bachelor of Science in chemistry. And I knew that by making that decision that I would have to keep going. So I knew that I would have to do a master's and probably a PhD. So at the moment that I decided to stay on and do chemistry, I felt that my path was set out at that point.
You've committed the next 10 years, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. But I loved it so much that it was like a relief that I could just do that. And then a big moment was when in New Zealand at that time, you applied for all PhD scholarships through a central agency at the government. So I put my application in for the scholarships overseas and I was unsuccessful in all of them. Really? And so I didn't know what I was going to do next. But what I came to realise later was that the scholarship that I got to Cambridge was decided much later. So I felt that I had missed out on everything. But about 3 months later, I was phoned up and said that I'd won this scholarship to Cambridge. So suddenly my life was turned upside down again. I assumed that I was just going to continue on in New Zealand. And then...
You had just recovered from the grieving process, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think I had 6 weeks to get myself to Cambridge.
Wow.
And I hadn't written my master's thesis at that stage. So I sat down and I wrote my master's thesis in a month, and then I got on a plane and went to Cambridge. So that was a turning point. Later, after I finished my PhD in Cambridge, I was awarded a fellowship to Trinity College, which was a 5-year position at Cambridge. And once again, I was forced to make the decision, well, shall I stay on here or shall I go home? Mm-hmm. And after really agonising over it, I decided to come home to New Zealand. And so that was a really big decision to make. So I decided to forego my fellowship in Cambridge and come home to New Zealand to try to carve out a career in New Zealand because I felt that's where I wanted to live. So that's what I've done.
So what was it like then when you started that first faculty position? I think you started as a lecturer at Auckland University. Was it a difficult transition for you or did it work pretty naturally?
Well, there was a period in between. So I got a postdoctoral position in New Zealand before I got a faculty position.
Gotcha.
And so I was a postdoc in New Zealand, and that transition was very, very traumatic, I have to say. Coming from Cambridge to New Zealand, it was slightly unfortunate. I had a postdoc position in a government research agency in New Zealand, which was going through a lot of change at the time. New Zealand's science system was overhauled in the early 90s. And so I came back to a really, really difficult environment. And I've seen this happen to quite a few young researchers who come back to New Zealand. They find it quite traumatic coming home because the system is so different from everywhere else. And there's this period of adjustment mm-hmm. where you really have to sort of face up to the realities of doing science in a reasonably well-funded system, but you're pretty much on your own. It's nothing like the big universities, which are much better funded.
Gotcha. Well, interesting to hear more about your journey, Vic, and some of the different steps that you took along the way. And I'm curious to hear now about one of these projects that you're working on that you are the most excited about. We had a teaser at the beginning of the episode, but now you can go into detail on one of them.
Well, the project that we're working on at the moment, which is the most exciting, involves a collaboration with a soil scientist called Professor Louis Schipper, who I think that has been on your show.
He has. He was fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. And this collaboration started 3 years ago. I was very interested in the evolution of enzymes. And one of the critical features of evolving enzymes is their temperature dependence. So enzymes are relatively unstable molecules, so temperature can have quite a dramatic effect on them. And in fact, temperature can destroy them, as we all know when we boil an egg. So we were very interested in the evolution of the temperature response of enzymes. And we stumbled across really a feature of enzymes which is sort of based in really old thermodynamics. In talking to Louis, some of the properties of the enzymes we were studying appeared to be mirrored in the properties of soil respiration, which is moderated by microbes in the soil. And we recognized some similarities between the molecular biology, so the temperature dependence of individual enzymes, and the temperature dependence of soil microbial processes. And so we started working on this collaboration, and it's been absolutely fantastic because I think we've really cemented the idea that the fundamental properties of the enzymes are reflected in the temperature dependent properties of much larger ecosystems. So we've now developed a sort of model whereby we feel justified in scaling up what we see at the basic level of enzymes up to ecosystems, and in straddling this divide between, say, soil science and molecular biology, we've had a lot of fun on the way as well.
Absolutely. And I love seeing as science progresses over the years how interdisciplinary so many of the fields are becoming. I think these are something where no one would have fathomed these connections, 50 years ago.
No.
But now you're like seeing them everywhere you look.
Yeah, and you have to speak a different language when you interact with scientists from another field. I've sort of had to learn basically all of the important papers published in soil science, which has been fascinating, reading the soil science literature and seeing how they deal with things in such a different way to the molecular biologists, for example.
Well, this is very interesting. And thinking about this relationship between temperature dependence, enzymes, and some of the soil microbes, is this something you see in a variety of different environments, or is it predominantly in more temperate environments? I'm thinking in like a really hot desert situation, would you have that temperature dependence because the soil, or perhaps sand in many cases, may not have a rich colony of microbes?
This is some of the things that we're trying to get to grips with. So we've started looking at soils from cold environments and from hot environments. But the fundamentals of the model that we're building up are sort of based on thermodynamics. So in principle, they should apply in any environment. And where we stumbled across the original idea was looking at thermophiles. Mm-hmm. So we were looking at thermophilic enzymes, which operate quite nicely at 95 degrees. So one of the conundrums in enzymology, which has been a conundrum for 60 or 70 years, is the relationship between the enzyme's activity, so how fast it makes the reaction go, and its stability. And these two things are really intimately linked. But in principle, you could have one without the other, or vice versa. So we're trying to build up the model based on thermodynamics. And so in principle, it should apply in any environment. And what we're seeing is we've got more and more evidence that it applies across environments. So that's really interesting.
Well, this is fascinating research. Now, we're talking about models now. Do you do computer science modeling work as well as bench work?
I've been starting to do a lot more. So it goes back to my PhD days. Really, my sort of mantra is that we need to collect really high quality data. Mm-hmm. So we still do a lot of lab work to try to collect data, but the modelling is starting to take greater and greater precedence. So now I have a PhD student who's working in collaboration with some great people at the University of Bristol, and we're doing molecular dynamics. So we're looking at the fundamental properties of the enzymes at the molecular level. And then we've just started a collaboration with a scientist in Arizona who is modelling climate scale things. So we're trying to work across the spectrum, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Find experts in any area you can and connect with them. I think that is a great approach.
Yeah, we're not modelers. We collect the data.
Well, Vic, wonderful to hear more about the work that's going on in your lab and one of these exciting projects that you guys are diving into. But I think so far we've talked about a lot of the great aspects of your career and your journey as a scientist. And we've hinted at some of the challenges, some of the struggles that you face. But I really think it's important to talk about these, to bring these to light, because I think oftentimes what people see as non-scientists are the success stories, the victories. They don't see everything that came before it. So can you share with us today one of your own struggles, challenges, or failures and how you got through it?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, which we sort of touched on earlier, was when I returned to New Zealand. I think I met a set of circumstances which were very, very challenging and very difficult, because I ended up in an institute which was sort of in turmoil itself due to it being restructured. And I had come back to New Zealand having foregone a kind of prestigious fellowship, so I was sort of feeling guilty about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I found myself really questioning whether science was the thing for me. And in fact, I very seriously considered going back to university and doing a law degree, because I felt that this was just not going to work.
Really? So what kept you pushing on and kept you from going back and getting that law degree?
Well, interestingly, I decided to try to take some action. I decided that, okay, this is really important. So I sort of got politically involved. And I actually, in the end, wrote to our Minister of Science, and I met with him and explained the really difficult situation that young researchers were finding in New Zealand. And that sort of gave me some hope, I think, that there was a future, because the minister was very reasonable. So I got politically involved, which I think really spurred me on to try and make a difference. And then that also motivated me to stay in science as well. I then moved to the University of Auckland and started a scientific career and really just settled down and got on with it. Mm-hmm. But I did spend a period of about a year really doubting whether that was the right thing to do or not.
Definitely. And I think there are a lot of researchers out there right now who might be on the fence, who maybe have gotten through undergraduate or PhD or even are in their postdoc, trying to figure out what their next step looks like. So it's this period of turmoil and indecision and applying to a million things and kind of trying to figure out what your next step is that I think a lot of scientists go through. And it's a stressful time. And you always look back at whatever decision you make and wonder if it was the right one. So it sounds like you had some doubts in your mind, but do you feel like overall satisfied with the path that you took?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I wouldn't have been happy doing anything else, I'm sure. Right. So I did make the right decision. I have teenage children and I see them debating with themselves about what the right thing to do is. What my son is about to go to university next year and he doesn't know what to do. And I think that the important thing is that it's quite okay not to know what to do.
Mm-hmm. I think it's even normal, right?
Yeah, so I just say to my son, look, it's fine. You'll find what you want to do, but you've got to be patient. You just got to try some different things. And really, part of my problem, I think, is that I was very impatient. Mm-hmm. Back then, I felt that I should know and that it wasn't okay to be vacillating.
Right.
So I compounded the problems, I think.
Yeah. And I think rightfully so. I think a lot of scientists, and you've been through so many years of training, you feel like you should have the next step figured out, but oftentimes it's not the case. And I think that is a great message to share with our listeners is it's okay to not really know what your next step is going to be sometimes. And sometimes you do just have to ride it out, follow your passion, continue to do things that you like to do until you find a permanent position, until you find a place where it's a good fit for you. So
absolutely.
Great to hear your story and wonderful to share some of these challenges that scientists face. But we don't only want to talk about the challenges and the tough times. Can you tell us next, Vic, about one of your success stories, one of these happy moments in science?
I think the best success story that I've got is perhaps a small one, but nevertheless, it was a great moment when we first stumbled across this idea of being able to scale up our thermodynamics from the enzymes to the ecosystem scale. We really felt that we were onto something really big. And so we wrote a paper and we sent to Nature, and it got rejected from Nature. And we sent it to Science, got rejected from there. We sent it to the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it went out for review and it got rejected. And the editor said to us in his or her letter, "You may very well be right, but fools rush in where angels fear to tread."
Wow.
And
it's almost poetic.
It is, yeah. And so we were feeling pretty despondent at this stage because we felt that we were onto something big, but
no one was willing to jump on with it. Yeah.
Absolutely not. And so then finally we sent it to a journal, which is really a very nice journal, which is the Journal of the American Chemical Society. And the editor rejected it without sending it for review. And at this stage, I was completely despondent.
Right, you're 4 journals in and yeah.
We're not onto something big, that we're kidding ourselves. But nevertheless, I wrote to the editor because I was at my wit's end, and I wrote to the editor and said, look, we've got this problem. We're spanning the disciplines and you've told us that it's not suitable for the Chemical Society, but we've also learned from the biological journal that it's not suitable for a biological journal because it's got too much thermodynamics in it. could you please send it out for review because we're having real difficulties? And the editor said yes.
Really?
Completely to my surprise.
Wow.
Not only said yes, he said, I will make sure I try and find the right reviewers because I agree with you, you're stuck in between.
Right, no man's land there.
And the editor obviously found 3 reviewers who were experts in thermodynamics, molecular biology, and had some knowledge of the ecosystem stuff. And we got 3 of the best reviews I've ever got, and it was immediately published.
Wow.
And that was just a great day because it kind of like, okay, we didn't get published in the top journal, but it was fantastic that the editor could see our difficulties and was really happy to respond to them in a way that gave us a fair review. And then 3 reviewers were absolutely fantastic and just wrote really nice reviews about our work and wrote reviews that said how significant it was, and that was just a fantastic day.
Well, Vic, you sold this as a small success, but this sounds like a huge victory to me. I don't know that I've ever gotten 3 glowing reviews from a reviewer. And
it's been really nice. The paper has been read by a lot of people, and I've met some people just out of the blue who've read the paper without me knowing about it and saying how nice it is, and so that's been fantastic. It's been really great.
Well, congratulations again on this success. And I think this is a great example of how in science, sometimes you do have to kind of be the squeaky wheel there. You have to speak up and not just go along with some of these decisions that are made and make sure that you are getting a fair chance at publishing your work.
The lesson for me there was I was at my wit's end, but I kind of wrote a plaintive letter to the editor. Mm-hmm. I didn't think it was going to work, but that, I think, led the editor to empathise with us. I understand that some other people have a tactic of writing rather robust letters to the editor.
Strongly worded, perhaps, yes.
Exactly, yeah. I feel that the plaintive letter, although I didn't deliberately write a plaintive letter, I was truly resigned to the fact that we weren't going to get it published. I felt that that was a really great interaction, that he could see our dilemma and was really happy to help us.
Fantastic. Well, lessons learned here are definitely valuable to our listeners out there who might be in a similar field, in a similar position where they're kind of stuck between, where there's not a good journal that's an obvious fit for what they're working on. So glad we shared this example. And we've talked about your work a little bit and your life outside of science as well. And one of the things that I do like to chat with all of our guests about are some of the books that they're reading. I love getting book recommendations from everyone on the show for myself and our listeners out there. So Vic, can you tell us about a book that you've really enjoyed?
I would say I'm an omnivorous reader. So
I like it. I'm going to have to adopt that.
So this is a difficult question. I've narrowed it down to 2 books that I've read recently. I read quite a lot of fiction, so I have to recommend to your listeners The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. And the reason I feel obliged to recommend it is that it's a fantastic book of fiction, but it's also written by a New Zealander, and she is only the 2nd New Zealander to win the Man Booker Prize. So we're very proud of her. So I'm recommending that as a book of fiction. And it's set in New Zealand as well in the gold rush. And so it sort of paints an interesting picture of historical New Zealand. But in the non-fiction genre, I think the most significant book that I've read recently is Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. This is an amazing book, and it speaks to lots of things that I hold dear. It's his life's work based on data that he has collected over the last 25 years on the flow of capital in Europe over the last 300 years. And so it's very data rich, but it paints a picture of Western economics, which I had never considered before. And he's become kind of a rock star of economics. I think he's met with the US president and he's met with various presidents and prime ministers in Europe because his book has had so much impact. And so I can strongly recommend that book as a sort of a changing your view of the world book.
Definitely. Well, this sounds like the perfect economics or history book for scientists who are always asking the question, show me the data, give me the numbers,
Exactly. Yeah. It's almost too much. The book is very large and it's absolutely chocker full of data.
Gotcha. Well, we will put those out on our website for our listeners to find out there. And we've talked a little bit throughout our conversation about some of these opportunities that you've had to travel as part of your career. And I think this is one of the fantastic aspects of careers in science is you do get to see the world and share your research and work with a lot of different people from a lot of different places. So Vic, can you tell us about your favorite place that science has taken you?
Well, this is a really difficult question because, as you say, one of the great things about science is it is a passport to travel. New Zealanders are traditionally very well travelled anyway because we live like right in the bottom corner of the Pacific. And so New Zealanders feel obliged to travel to see the world because we're sort of so remote from it.
Mm-hmm.
If I was to name the most interesting place in terms of its impact on me was when I went to a conference in Santa Fe, and we went to Los Alamos for the day and went to the museum in Los Alamos to look at the Manhattan Project. And there were protesters outside the museum, and that day rests with me in terms of the interface between science and politics and global conflict, and then the ongoing struggles. It really affected me a lot to think that you're not doing science in isolation. And so I found Los Alamos a very sobering and interesting place to visit.
Definitely. Well, wonderful to hear about one of these places that left a lasting impact on you. And I've actually never been there myself. So can you describe a little bit what it was like kind of walking through that museum, or if there were other sites that you saw while you were there that you enjoyed?
Well, it's interesting because it's hidden away. I think it's in the Los Alamos National Forest, or I probably got that wrong. It's quite a long time ago that I went there. So you have to drive up through the forest to get there. And of course, it's hidden away for good reason, because my understanding of the history is that the project was a secret project during the Second World War. And so that immediately sort of has an impact on you, that you need to drive up through this forest. And then we read about in the museum. I mean, the museum itself is absolutely fascinating because it also documents the day-to-day lives of the scientists who were working there. They weren't allowed to communicate, and there were irregular deliveries of mail and things like that. So there were sort of interesting stories of the scientists' lives. And then there were also interesting historical aspects of what was going on during the war. And then the contemporary aspects were also very interesting, because there were protesters. The day we visited the museum, there were protesters outside who were trying to highlight the political aspects of the day. And so it was almost an interesting historical thing, but then the contemporary aspects of the politics of war and conflict and things were also there, because we had to walk past these protesters to get into the museum.
Sure. It's almost kind of giving you a perspective of science's place in society, really historically and currently, it sounds like. So
yeah, and at the time, I think why it had an impact, at the time I was reading a biography of Feynman, who was one of the famous scientists who worked at Los Alamos. And so that had an impact. And I also had just read a book which had a huge impact on me called Voltaire's Bastards by John Ralston Saul. This book was all about how things can go so badly wrong if you just rely on reason and nothing else. He calls it the tyranny of reason.
Interesting.
So if you just use reason in the absence of any human impacts, or then you'll end up doing things which are despicable. And this was at a time when I was trying to work my ideas out. And so it was fascinating.
Well, thank you so much for sharing the details of this travel experience. And I love being able to almost travel vicariously through all the different people that I talk to. So
Santa Fe is also a beautiful place. So we were at a conference in Santa Fe, and I can recommend that as a place to visit as well.
Excellent. Well, listeners, if you're looking for your next travel destination, definitely check out Santa Fe and stop by that museum while you're there, too, if you want to really immerse yourself, it sounds like, in the science, the history, the ethics, and everything that goes along with it.
Absolutely.
So fantastic to hear about this travel opportunity. And we've talked a little bit about some of the people who you've worked with throughout the course of your career. And I think the people are also another aspect about careers in science that make it really exciting and fun. I think there's some stereotypes out there about what scientists are typically like. And we like to dispel some of those stereotypes on our show, because I think there are so many examples of people who do not fit that mold. And I think some of the examples of this are just when you look around your laboratory, some of the funny memories that you've shared with people, or just some of the quirky traditions that have developed in the different groups that you've worked in. So, Vic, can you tell us about some of these traditions or memories that you've experienced?
Well, we've touched on one of them. So whenever we have a student graduate with a PhD, we always have a celebration. In New Zealand, we have an oral examination for the PhD. Mm-hmm. The oral examination is conducted by an external examiner in a closed room. And so no one really knows what's going to happen.
The scary, mysterious thing, yeah.
The student and the examiner emerge from the oral exam. And in all of the cases that I've been involved with so far, the student is successful. And so we always have champagne in the office next door to the lab. And then the student is awarded the book, which is Dr. Seuss, Oh, the Places You'll Go. And that turns into a great occasion, because often the human element is injected into that, because the supervisor sits in on the oral exam. So you've just spent perhaps 2 hours discussing the minutiae of enzyme kinetics. Mm-hmm. And then you go to the lab and there's champagne. And often For example, my last PhD student had 3 young boys, and so her husband and the 3 young boys were there. And so you'll suddenly come out of this rather closeted world of evolution of enzymes and kinetics to the real world where we have the family and friends and a proper party. And it's really good. It's a very nice contrast because it shows you that the science is being conducted in the real world. And in fact, the PhD student who graduated, I think her most incredible achievement was to do a PhD whilst being a mother of young children. I mean, I don't think I could do that. Incredibly challenging thing to do. And what an achievement, an amazing achievement. I take my hat off to her.
Certainly. I know I feel the same way looking at some of my friends, colleagues, people I know who have gone through the same thing, raising their family during their PhD. I know by the end of it, I was like barely showering, hardly functional as a human being, but yeah. Somehow they're responsible for children. So.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible.
Well, Vic, great to hear more detail about these traditions. I'm curious, how did this book tradition start? Was this something that you had experienced in a previous lab that you brought with you, or was this something you developed?
I moved to Waikato 9 years ago, and we've been really lucky. We have a group of about 12, and I can put down quite a few of the lab traditions to our lab manager, who's absolutely fantastic, and I couldn't survive without her. Her name is Judith Burrows, and she is a great baker of cakes.
Ooh.
And so we have a tradition in the lab that if you're giving a talk or if there's any occasion, then there needs to be accompanied by baking. And I think that the tradition of giving the book is hers. I think it came from her.
Wonderful.
But I know that I liked the book before that. So perhaps it was a mixture of her and me. I don't know how it arose. So our lab is always full of baking. I think there's baking twice a week, I would say.
Wow.
And then every so often there's champagne. We also have champagne whenever a paper is accepted. So that's a tradition in the lab as well.
Well, I love to hear that you take the time to celebrate these accomplishments of your laboratory. I think that's so important. And I think you can never have too much cake in the lab. So wonderful tradition to have.
Thinking uses up a lot of energy, a lot of calories.
That's right. You need the glucose, right? Well, Vic, great to hear about your traditions, like I said. And we've talked a little bit about your research, about your laboratory, and some of the questions that you guys have been answering over the years. But I'm curious to hear next about one of these questions that you haven't been able to answer. Maybe there are things in the way, things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility, the things that generally are restraints in science. So if we took all of those problems away, Vic, can you tell us what is the question you would want to answer?
Well, so if I was unhindered by the practicalities, the question that I'm most fascinated by is the flow of energy through biological systems. I think that biological systems have evolved over 3.5 billion years, and their greatest achievement is to harness energy and then regulate its flow to allow growth and allow life. In a way, we are investigating this in a small way, looking at the thermodynamics of enzymes. But really, I think it would be fantastic to understand in real detail the relationship between biological growth or life and energy. Because I think that just as we're seeing renewable energy, basically the renaissance of renewable energy at the moment, the masters of renewable energy are microbes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they can take energy from almost any source that you can think of and use it to grow. And so I think that understanding how energy flows through biological systems would not only be sort of some fundamental importance, but it would also be of practical importance to our sustainability on the planet.
Certainly. Well, what a great question. And I love kind of zooming out, taking this big picture perspective and thinking about these big questions that really span over a variety of different fields, kind of encompass a lot of different research areas. So thank you so much for sharing this big question that you have in your mind, Vic. And we've talked a lot about your career and a lot of the different aspects of it, the different steps you've taken to get to where you are today. And I think all along your journey are different people that you've come across. And from these people, you get a lot of great advice and perhaps some not so great advice. But can you share with us today, Vic, what you would consider, looking back in hindsight, as the best piece of advice you have ever received?
Of course, we all get lots of advice during the course of our careers. I think the best piece of advice that I've ever received was during my political activism. We organised a conference around science and society in New Zealand, and we were lucky enough to have at that conference a really famous New Zealander who was based in the US called Anne Firth Murray. And Anne Firth Murray is famous because she founded the Global Fund for Women. She started the Global Fund for Women from scratch, and it's now a very significant philanthropic organisation which funds women's issues around the world, and particularly in the developing world. And so she came to New Zealand and participated in our conference on science and society, and I was lucky enough to have dinner with her. And her advice at that time to us, we were kind of young and impatient and anxious to make a difference and all that kind of stuff. And her advice was, well, according to her, you spend the first third of your life sorting out your ideas and sorting out your thinking. And then you should spend the next third of your life doing, so taking action once you've sorted your ideas out. And then you should spend the last third of your life facilitating others to take action. So mentoring, I think, is what she means.
Sure.
That really resonated with me because what it means is that it's okay to spend the first third of your life, till you're 30 or so, just trying to sort things out in your head, testing ideas, working stuff out, changing your mind. But then it's important to sort of settle on some ideas and take action and to work hard for a long period of time. That's how I feel at the moment. I'm in this process of having settled on a few ideas to work really hard and take action on them. And so I'm involved in some community action here in my hometown, and I'm involved in my science. And then once you've done that, then it's really important to help the next generation.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is excellent advice. And I really like this emphasis on like thinking and then doing and then really paying it forward, I think, at the end, which is
exactly
fantastic way to think about your life as you go through it. The things, sort of your to-do list you have to check off as you go. Well, Vic, is there any other last piece of advice or maybe one last piece of inspiration you want to leave our listeners with today now coming from you?
Well, I think that because I'm naturally impatient and I'm naturally sort of champing at the bit, I want to emphasise the importance of patience. This is advice to myself, really.
We're all listening, though. We're all listening.
Yeah. That in today's world where everything has to be instant and headlines and the latest, greatest thing, that it's important to have patience and diligently work away. And then good things will happen is my motto at the moment.
Well, I like that. I know I'm sort of perpetually an impatient person myself. So this is advice that I should definitely be taking as well. And Vic, thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today. Can you tell our listeners now how they can reach out and learn more about what you're doing?
Well, if you're interested in my science, then my Google Scholar page is open. So if you just want to look at the stuff we've published and the sorts of things that we're doing. But if you're interested in anything else, then I'm really happy for people to email me. My email address is varcus@waikato, waikato.ac.nz.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely take a look at what Vic is working on and get in touch if you have any questions. And Vic, thank you again so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story.
Thank you very much, Marie.
Well, this was a pleasure. Thank you, listeners out there. Join us again next time for another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.